This October, Michael Downs will be teaching a month-long course at the Portal focused on the work of Nick Land, Slavoj Žižek, and the technological singularity. To learn more or to sign up, check the links in the description, and I hope to see you there. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name's Cadell Last, and I'm here today with Michael Downs. Michael Downs is an underground theorist, author of the Dangerous Maybe blog, and he will be teaching a course at the Portal this October titled Nick Land, Slavoj Žižek, and Technological Singularity. You can get involved through Michael Downs' Patreon, which will be linked below. In signing up, you will get access to all the live events, as well as indefinite access to the recordings afterwards. In this podcast, we will be discussing themes inspired by Michael Downs' writings, as well as what we hope to approach in our course at the Portal this October. Welcome back to the channel, Michael. And first, I want to ask you, and I think our starting point for both our work in the Portal and this podcast should be something like, what the hell is the technological singularity?
Right? I mean, that's seems to be, it's funny, Cadell. I was talking to some friends the other day, and I told them, I'm like, it's funny. I grew up in the 80s watching all these sci-fi movies about AI and all this, and at a certain point, I feel like I woke up and I'm living inside a movie. And as funny as that sounds, I feel like that's it. And why? Well, it seems like we're on a path towards the production of superintelligence, the emergence of a superintelligent entity or entities in the world. And, at one point this was just sci-fi. Now it seems like we're starting to feel that this entity is building itself into existence before our very eyes. And certainly the LLMs, the large language models, or the chatbots, they're not this thing. But it seems like they're forerunners to this thing. And AI theory, AI theory has had its ups and downs. There's moments where it seems like AI is really taken off, and then it kind of goes into a lull, and then it bursts back on. So 90s was real big for it. You have guys like Nick Land, who came out of, a continental philosophy background, but also started theorizing AI on the basis of that continental philosophy background. And then you have, the last 2 decades or so, kind of not much going on with AI, at least not, anything the average person's thinking about. And then 2 years ago, boom. Now we have these chat bots. Hell, people are using them to do therapy now. I know people who are doing therapy with ChatGPT. And it seems like this is slowly but surely working its way into our lives in very sci-fi types of ways. And so the techno-capital singularity, what is it? Well, a singularity is basically just like with a black hole. Basically, the idea is once you cross a certain threshold, there's no way to predict what's going to happen. What lies on the other side of that threshold being crossed. And with the emergence of artificial intelligence, the idea is that at some point we're going to reach a threshold beyond which we can't even predict what this thing will do, the consequences it'll have for us as a species, the consequences it'll have for society as a whole. And it is this technological singularity, this threshold in technological development beyond which we can't really even begin to postulate or imagine what the hell is going to happen. So I guess that's how I would start off by defining the technological singularity.
Yeah, I think it's the zero level of the concept, just the breakdown of the prediction horizon. And I think what's super interesting from a scientific point of view is that science really got its cultural standing in the early modern period because of its predictive capacities. And there's something really strange with, and ironic perhaps historically, about the fact that science both got its cultural credibility because of its capacity for prediction, and then science, through its own historicity, starts to generate technology which breaks down its very capacity to make predictions. And and I think that there's something really important about that. I actually stumbled upon a quote from a mutual inspiration of ours, Jacques Lacan, who said, "The only science worth paying attention to is science fiction." And of course, you have someone like Zizek emphasizing the reality of fiction. And I think that that's true also when it comes to science. One of the most interesting things about science is the way in which it produces science fiction like scenarios that we increasingly find ourselves in. And one of the inspirations for me when I was coming into my intellectual maturity was, as you know, was Ray Kurzweil. And he generated these prediction horizons saying in 2029 we're going to have human level language capacities in machines. In 2045 we're going to have beyond AGI, beyond human level intelligence, beyond human level super intelligence. And that always blew me away because I was like, well, I'm going to be alive during these dates. If there's anything true about these predictions, that's going to be my reality. I'm going to have to live through that. And that kind of was a fundamental motivation for me. But the question I want to throw to you is that I think you come at the technological singularity from a different theoretic point of view, in the sense that I was more inspired by Kurzweil and you were more inspired by Nick Land. And I've been motivated by your observation that Nick Land brings something interesting to technological singularity theory because he views it from the perspective of capitalism. So could
Right.
you expand a little bit about how you understand the difference between more of the technologists like Kurzweil and Bostrom versus a figure like Nick Land, and why Land's view on this is so important?
Yeah, this is actually one of the topics I wanted to discuss with you. So because we haven't really had a chance to, I mean, we've both written books essentially about AI. I mean, mine's a little bit more all over the place, but your global brain singularity is completely about that. And one of the things I find, like, you're right, where to me, the reason I am a Landian in this very specific sense, because there's all kinds of ways I have my disagreements with Nick. But what I think he's tapped into is best embodied in his most succinct, uh, like formulation of his position, which is capitalism is artificial intelligence. And having spent many years of my life trying to think about this, I just think that thesis is true. And so with Kurzweil and Bostrom, my critique, because here's the thing, I mean, these guys are brilliant and they have so much to offer to AI theory. It's undeniable. But what I would say from the Landian perspective is just like, guys, you kind of talk about this like it's developing in a void. And what I like about Land at this specific point is that it's him at his most Marxist. He's saying you can't separate the production of this specific type of technology from the capitalist mode of production. There's something inherent to the very structure of capitalist accumulation that's geared towards the production of artificial intelligence. And I think that's what's unique about his theory of AI and that MCM prime, that Marxist formula for capital, money invested in commodity production, commodities sold, that in sold at a profit, right? You gain surplus value in the sale of the commodity. Something about this logic, something about this circuit is geared towards the refinement and enhancement of AI. Now, for Nick, he would think markets themselves are a kind of artificial intelligence with how they, this is the Austrian influence on him. It's what's unique, right? Like, he's as much influenced by Marx as he is the Austrian school. And he views in, certain papers that Hayek wrote and these guys that markets function as AI because it's not humans that are determining the prices of things. Markets function as an AI system even back then. So even when capital begins to emerge, it's already AI. the point is that it goes from that type of AI into what we nowadays are talking about as AI, based on, look, capitalism is geared towards hyper efficiency, right? So it wants production to speed up to the point to maximize profits, etc. Well, with the human, you're always going to hit a wall with what we're able, how much we can speed up, how efficient we can be. And this is why automation has always been part of the capitalist mode of production. And Marx knew it, right? Like, how do you outcompete your competitors? Well, you automate production more and more. You invest in machinery that can perform the task quicker than humans. And so for a brief period of time, you're going to get the upper hand in the market, right? And so this type of competitive, this drive of competition to have the most profit and the biggest share of the market necessarily imposes this trajectory of develop your means of production, develop your infrastructure at your factory so as to produce quicker than the other capitalists. And the logic baked into that is, well, make the machines do it. Well, the problem is with non-AI machines is that they also can only do so much. But if you can enhance the intelligence of machines, then you can truly replace human labor power with machine labor power. Now, you get into the whole Marxist problem, like, yeah, but humans have their labor power is unique. Um, you can only extract surplus labor on the basis of wages, and the discrepancy by how much value the human creates opposed to what you give them in a wage, and there's this discrepancy. Sure, right? But the logic of the capitalist system is maximize efficiency, maximize speed, maximize return of profits. And to do that, you're going to have to automate beyond the human capacity. And that's why, in part, Land thinks that AI emerges via capital accumulation. And so, yeah, I think that's what Kurzweil and Bostrom and other AI theorists, like, it's not just something that scientific geniuses are cooking up in a lab. That's part of it, sure, because humans are the coders, etc. Um, but at a certain point, the logic takes on a life of its own. And I mean, we're already seeing that with deep learning, where once they configure the code in a certain way, it does the rest. And then nobody, and you were talking about predictability, nobody really can predict what it's going to do once this program gets up and running. And so now, deep learning, it's kind of like a black box where even the people who set it up in the first place don't understand and are unable to predict what it's going to do.
Yeah, and there's a lot of specialists in AI today that are sounding the alarm. I think someone like Geoffrey Hinton comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
Often, referred to as the father or the godfather of AI, and now he's
Yeah.
actually quit his job and is dedicating his life to, sounding the alarm, so to speak. And you're right about your emphasis on Land, with the link between capitalism and artificial intelligence being a salient point, which perhaps is the ultimate blind spot for someone like Ray Kurzweil, because I remember in successive readings of The Singularity is Near, I started to clue in that, wait a second here, Kurzweil is basically hypothesizing that free market liberalism will take us to a positive technological singularity. So he does have this kind of unconscious assumption,
Does
which
he? Okay.
which allows him to become non-political, or allows him to remain apolitical, or even allows and safeguards a kind of naive positivity and optimism which he never really deeply questions. And I think that that's performative as well, because he started working at Google, he started participating in the very processes that he was forwarding in The Singularity is Near, basically participating in the free market mechanisms that would lead to the production of artificial general intelligence. And I think that's all sort of the problem with technological singularity theory. And I did bring that up with Ben Goertzel, who's I think another really important technological singularity theorist, who's far more open about discussing the political dimensions of things.
Hmm.
which I think that's what really needs to be done in technological singularity theory, is more political economic analysis and more reflective awareness about how artificial intelligence is changing our political economies. And in regards to Land's thesis that the markets are already I think I hear him inspired by not only, of course, Adam Smith's Invisible Hand, but then Alenka Zupancic with her brilliant idea in What is Sex about the invisible hand job, that this free market starts to reproduce itself at the expense of human beings, not
Yes.
for our benefit. So, another important thing I think, and why philosophy is so important, and why I started getting into philosophy in the first place, was actually this dogmatic emphasis on efficiency is itself not the truth, right? And I
Yeah.
think that people get blinded to that. People think efficiency is the truth, and I think that that's why I say, patience of the concept. We got to slow down. Efficiency is not necessarily the truth here. And I think when it comes to someone like Marx and revisiting Marxist theory, and here I bring it to sort of a question for you on Land and Marx, is that right from the beginning in Marx's work, he recognizes that capital is kind of an inhuman dimension,
Hmm.
and that capitalists and proletariat alike are slaves to it in a deep sense. And I think the irony here is that Marx envisioned a possibility for humans, wage laborers, proletarian subjectivity, to overcome this inhuman dimension of capital and to build a higher level of socialism or communism. Whereas the reality is we've seen the relentless development of industrial capitalism through waves of industrial technologies, now culminating with artificial intelligence, which bring us to a much darker reality. And I think you comment on this in regards to both Land's transcendental miserabilism and also, sort of the way in which even Marxists today, after the Frankfurt School, find themselves in a kind of doomer position. So could you maybe expand on why you think Marxist theory has gone from a kind of utopian humanism for the future, where we can sort of throw off our chains and collectively self-organize towards a higher humanist world, but now find ourselves in a situation where even leftists themselves and Marxists themselves can do nothing but occupy a kind of politically impotent position?
Yeah. So there's a lot there. I mean, I think part of the deadlock here is what I was saying earlier, where I feel like I woke up inside of a movie I would have watched as a kid. Um, Part of it is if you do now, there's certain Marxists I know who don't think AI is actually going to happen the way that someone like myself and I think they don't believe that this thing is going to be as big of a problem. Like Chris Catrone comes to mind, who I respect, and I just respectfully disagree on this point.
Right.
Um, right. So I think the Marxist approach is there's kind of two. One is to just say this whole thing about AI is capitalist hype and it's ideology, and it's not AI is not going to emerge as some super intelligent being. What I term Robo Cthulhu. Robo Cthulhu ain't going to happen. So we need to worry about the standard Marxist struggle for the emancipation of the working class. If you do take these AI futures seriously, then the problem is capital isn't just a virtual mechanism at work in the economy that leads to the exploitation of the masses. It is the larval seed of a super intelligent being. And it's like, well, okay, capital already controls all of the major institutions, it's the governing factor in our world. Now it's going to become a super intelligence. So I see the doomerism there. It's like, well, what do you do? Like, so the working class revolution is now what? The resistance against Skynet. Um, it just adds a whole nother layer to this problem. And then the question, like, we still don't know. I mean, does anybody really have the blueprint of how to organize the working class at this point with how much fragmentation, divide, scattered identifications within it? Nobody knows how to get the vast majority of the workers on the same page. Now you have to deal with the AI thing. But I mean, there are people who are, I would say, of a Marxist spirit, even if they don't call themselves Marxists. You have the left accelerationists like Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams in their book Inventing the Future that say, look, we need a kind of navigational acceleration of technology. We need obviously state mechanisms in place that can guide the acceleration to the emancipation of the human, where we're freed from work. Uh, you know, and look, like, as an ideal, I'm all for it. Bring it on. Um,
Hmm.
my thing is, because yeah, at the level of ideal or what I want, yeah, bring on the leftist accelerationists, uh, no work future, right? All good, 100%. But the Landian skepticism in me is just, I don't know if we can. We have never been able to get control of capital. We've had little moments where we've forced it to, like, okay, the post-war era where there was much more redistribution, social welfare state, but Western capital, you could say, was also compliant because it was afraid of the East, communism in the East. There is no communism in the East anymore. Not, you know. So what is Western? I mean, now it's global capital. What is the
Yeah.
thing global capital is actually afraid of, or willing to compromise itself for? It doesn't have any type of enemy the way that Western capital had the Soviet bloc as an enemy. So I don't know. I'm a little skeptical about, can we actually control capital and navigationally guide it. It seems like the Jesus take the wheel. Sorry, Jesus can't take the wheel because capital's at the wheel. Uh, and it just, I don't know how we go about breaking that. I try to theorize what it would take. I think it has to do with a humanity that has been liberated from work for the most part, that have their time and energy to think, develop, cultivate themselves. Uh, and I just wonder if there's this brief moment in the trajectory of capitalism itself that opens this up as a possibility, where capital itself is automating, right? If it automates in the way that certain people think it will with their predictions, then there's going to be a lot of people out of work based on the development of AI. And it's real simple though. So capitalism itself pushes people out of work because it automates the means of production so as to make production more efficient. Okay, but somebody will say, but it also always creates new jobs that fill in the old jobs, and so humans stay employed. Okay, but again, the idea is once we cross a certain threshold, that doesn't hold anymore. And what happens if you have 70%, 80% of a population out of work because there's literally no jobs to give them? Then the question is, okay, but this is a contradiction in capital itself. Okay, problem is with these AI bots or these robots that you create. Yeah, you can use them in production, but they don't go out and consume. So who buys the shit that you produce when the the vast majority of the population is not receiving wages? So what do the capitalists then run to the state and start begging them to do UBI and give people universal basic income so they can consume? This is a deadlock that seems inherent to the system itself. And Nick Land would just say capitalism's never been about making humans happy. He describes it as, it's building itself, that the techno capital singularity is building itself out of its own enemy's resources, which is us and our ability to be creative and develop tech. So it exploits our abilities as humans for its own development. But the point is, it reaches a certain level of development where it just doesn't need us at all anymore. But the point is, in this thing where it's starting to put us out of work, now people are freed up from work, but if there's no way for them to have income, then it seems like the capitalist system itself implodes at this specific point because there's nobody to purchase the shit it's selling us. The question is there any way to take advantage of this particular situation? Maybe, maybe not. But I would say it's a good idea to think about this and plan for this as a moment of opportunity. Um, yeah, I mean, I've said a lot, so I'll let you take it from here. But that's I just think that there's a possibility baked into this based on this contradiction of capital. How to take advantage of it? I don't think we have the political resources right now, but and this sounds naive, but I think we got to speak from this position. We either figure this out or it's over for us, is what at least some of us think. So
I think that one of the things that blows my mind is that, and this is coming out of a more doomer Marxist trajectory, which is something like we all know the line, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capital. And
yeah,
that statement is so easy to repeat and so helpful to repeat because it's so true that it's easier for someone like Elon Musk to imagine building a Mars colony for a select group of people to escape to if the world collapses than it is for us to imagine wealth tax policy. Like, wealth tax policy is harder for us to wrap our minds around than a Mars colony. Like it's
right.
and it goes to extreme levels, and it's just like, why is there such a political impotence here? Is it because no humans are really in control and it really is just the inhuman dimension of capital which is going to repeat us forever, even to the point of our extinction or our annihilation? I always thought that the dream of capital was overcoming of the need for human labor because we're just in the way of the efficiency of the machine.
Mhm.
So it leads towards automation. But then the dream of the Marxists and the dream of labor, let's say, is that we could finally open up self-motivated work. And it seems like that's harder and harder to imagine that world. And in part AI complicates this as well, right? Like, where you have AI now, people are even writing raps with AI. People are making their beats their AI beats, right? Like, it's like there's nothing,
Talking about
like,
Drake here, wouldn't he be the first to do it?
I just started to hear that people are using ChatGPT to write their songs. Like, you just put in like an artist's name and you like write a Drake like song, and ChatGPT will spit it out in like 5 seconds, right? Like, so it's
Yeah,
like,
of course.
it's crazy. But like, I feel like in your work there is still this, even though you say, you're a doomer Marxist, emphasis on this side of things. Do you feel like there's still a sliver of hope for a world that literally opens up a higher level of self-motivated work? Because speaking for myself, and tell me if you think this is off, but speaking for myself, like, I don't want to just have the transcendence of capitalism for socialism or communism because I just want to sit on the beach all day and chill out. Like, I enjoy reading, I enjoy writing, I enjoy working, I enjoy thinking, as long as it's like my self-motivated passion. And insofar as capitalism gets in the way of that, insofar as wage labor gets in the way of that, it's an enemy, it's an obstacle. But do
Yeah,
you
I
do you
mean,
still hold on to that, like that the possibility that we could have a politics that centers the conditions of possibility for genuinely self-motivated work as a norm?
yeah, I mean, for me, that would be the ultimate goal, which is, the ability, for humanity, universally speaking, to live lives of passion. And passion here is not some concept of happiness with a capital H. There's no contradictions, there's no
Exactly.
antagonisms, there's no problems. No, it is the ability, on the basis of one having time and energy, to wake up in the morning, and when you wake up in the morning and get out of bed, you want to engage in what you're going to engage in throughout the day. Now, of course, there's going to be times that you can't always do this. There'll always be things in life that come up, but as a structural default setting, it would be the ability for human beings to passionately engage in their activity throughout the day. I'm hesitant to call it labor or work because you can just say, well, it's non alienated work, or it's, there's different ways to talk about it. But I don't know. I think work is something that human beings have been at been at war against since we hit a certain point in our development. And so it's not even that I'm just against wage labor. My problem is with necessary labor as a whole. And throughout history, it's always ended up where one tiny little group ends up having the power, and they don't have to do the work that everybody else has to do. And yeah, I just think that the fight for human emancipation has always been the fight for the emancipation from necessary labor, not activity, not and again, in 1 second I can switch to not good work, not good activity, but the type of drudgery that's soul crushing, uh, that
But do you
makes you feel like your life isn't meaningful. Yeah.
my question to you here is, do you think this dream of emancipation from necessary labor is something that's tied to the early modern period and early industrial processes? Do you think that this dream was even there before the early modern industrial period?
No, because there was no way to well, okay, I'll tell you why I think it was there. I think it was there in the form of religious fantasy, because
I agree.
all the
Yeah, that's
depictions
good.
of the afterlives, the gods don't work. Whether you look at the book of Revelation and you look at them going off into eternity, I mean, there's some vague depictions, but one thing's certain: they're not going to labor by the sweat of their brow, right? So this desire to be freed from work, I think, was there in visions of the afterlife. But did anybody think it was possible to do this
Yeah,
here
yeah,
in this
yeah.
world? No. So it always got projected as that's what heaven is you don't have to work.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
and you get you develop meaningful friendships. You develop your relationship with God even more in heaven. But the thing is with these depictions, they're always very limited. I don't see robust depictions
Yeah.
of what goes on in eternity because they are fantasies. There's no contradiction. There's no antagonism. Everything is at peace. Everything is made whole, and everything is basically reduced to the level of substance ontology. Everything is what it is. They can't change, and so everything's locked into metaphysical place, so to speak. The problem with that,
Right.
it's boring. Nothing happens, and so
Yeah.
they keep these depictions very, just like how movies always have the phantasmatic ending and then they immediately cut off. Slavoj always talks about this, where it's like, okay, I want the sequel to V for Vendetta. What happens the next day as they're trying to
Yeah.
build a new society? Well, religions also did this before movies, where they end on these phantasmatic peaks, but they don't show you like the working. Okay, so in the afterlife, what do humans do for the next? I mean, I know trying to say afterlife and then say trillion years is kind of contradictory, but doing the best I can with the language problem. What do they do day in and day out over there? And that's why we don't have these robust descriptions of it.
And
So I'll just
yeah.
say it was there. The hope
Yeah.
for the freedom from work, I think, has its history in pre-capitalist societies. Once we have the Industrial Revolution take hold, then you start getting people going, wait a second, is it possible to, can we free ourselves from work? If there's a certain amount of like automated production. And I think that's where it becomes something that is an imminent possibility in our world, opposed to a transcendent, eternal fantasy.
I'm really of the vision that, I just, as you know, I'm teaching the early Marx course right now, and we just did a lecture on the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. And I really think in that article you see Marx's communist vision as a kind of secular heaven that's a little bit similar to what you're talking about the religious fantasy of the afterlife, where he's describing communist as the individual, and the individual is unified with the species being, and communist man is somehow some non-lacking, non-antagonistic. Like, he does a very good job of describing the antagonism of feudalism. He does a very good job describing the antagonism of capitalism, and then he articulates a path towards a non-antagonistic state. And I think that the real challenge for theorists like us is, how do we think about a communism with antagonism and lack? And, perhaps there's visions here in contemporary leftist theory of, like, for example, fully automated luxury communism. And I know that someone like Nick Land thinks this is the worst possible outcome, like, as you've quoted. And I wonder
Yeah.
if he thinks it's the worst possible outcome because it's kind of this rehabilitation of a communism without antagonism or lack, that it's too positivistic in its conception.
So it's a good point, right? Look, I think with him, it's funny. I don't think he gets that there's moments where he's very Hegelian and doesn't realize it, because his main philosophical nemesis was Hegel. And so that obviously seems to put him at odds with Slavoj Žižek and Todd McGowan and all these guys. And so, my book and my work really kind of focuses on what I call the fault line theory, which is this fault line between the Ljubljana school with Zizek and Todd and Alenka and Mladen and Helen Rollins and Alfie Bone. And there's a whole group that comes, Matthew Flisvetter. There's a whole side of this that is inspired by, like, the Zizekian approach to things. And this really kind of started in the 90s and became a dominant trend in philosophy. At the same time, you had Nick Land and the CCRU developing at Warwick University, and there's all these strange overlaps and contradictions between these two schools of thought, and that's part of what I explore. I say all that to say this: Nick has always kind of pitted himself against Hegel, because Nick, in his 90s peak era, was very much a Deleuze-Guattarian. But at the same time, Nick has always had a place for negativity in his work that, the vitalist reading of D&G doesn't really leave room for. And there's moments where, when Nick says, like, anything great was hell-baked. It was baked in struggle and all that. It's very easy to read that in a kind of Hegelian way, right? And so, yeah, I think Nick doesn't like the idea of, he would call it difference. He doesn't like the idea of difference being subsumed under one totalizing identity. And there's ways people read Hegel that make Hegel into, like, the great identitarian. Like, everything is what it is within the absolute idea, and therefore all difference is actually negated. And you have a kind of, like, dialectical monism is the way that people read. Now, of course, Zizek doesn't read them that way. And the point is, if you read Hegel that way, it seems like you arrive at a point of non-contradiction, that you're
Yeah.
over the dialectical trajectory, dialectics ends, all is made whole, all is complete. And Slavoj and Todd have always just emphasized that is the exact opposite of what absolute knowing is for Hegel. Whereas absolute knowing is the realization that contradiction goes all the way down. And you have to struggle or tarry with the negative in order to reach this point of realizing, like, there's no escape from contradiction. It's ontologically constitutive of being. And so, with Nick emphasizing everything's baked in hell, yeah, I mean, he doesn't like this idea of some endpoint of non, I guess peace would be one way to say it, because he thinks everything emerges through antagonism and struggle. He just doesn't see how Hegelian that is. Now, of course, you can try to take a Deleuze-Guattarian cyberneticist approach to struggle and all of this, and think it in terms of positive feedback loops the way the CCRU did. But if ultimately you're saying that development is always spurred on through antagonism, through violent rupture, then you're pretty close to Zizek's Hegel.
Yeah. No, I think that obviously my introduction to Hegel was through Zizek. So my reading of Hegel has always been deeply inspired and colored by Zizek. I've actually understood what's going on in Zizek's Hegel as a kind of negative monism, a non-monism, like a black hole. Like it's more like a black hole than a bright sun.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very powerful point of view, so powerful, and not only just a powerful point of view, but I think one of the reasons why I went back to develop the courses on Hegel was to see if Zizek's reading of Hegel stood up to the actual text. Like, does this hold, or is this actually a false Hegel? Like, is Zizek twisting Hegel beyond his own words? And I don't
Mm-hmm.
think Zizek is. So ultimately, like my best example, and we just discussed this at length in the portal with Dylan Shaw, who's developing a Platonic conception of metaphysics, and Hegel on war, in the philosophy of right. Like Hegel thinks that we can't get rid of war. Like he states explicitly against Kant that he's against the perpetual peace. He doesn't think perpetual peace is possible. And he thinks all we can do is cultivate our ethical systems in order to navigate deeper contradiction and negativity of absolute world spirit, which is in and of itself not going to reconcile itself to human beings in that type of way. So my reading is actually that we have to think the unity of positive contradiction and absolute negativity, and that's the proper way to get at a rereading of Marx. And I think that in that sense, there is a conversation with the land that you're trying to engage with, because land kind of totally gets rid of any association with the humanist Marx.
Mm-hmm.
But you emphasize that he takes capital very seriously and even reads capital from the point of view of this monstrous force. And I think that Zizek does the same thing. So, what do you think there is at stake in a Landian, Zizekian reading of capital? Do they basically agree on the monstrosity of capital, but just disagree about our capacity to politically mobilize?
I think ultimately, and Slavoj would, I think he would resist this. I'm pretty sure he would. There's a humanist in Slavoj that isn't there in Land. And what I mean by that, look, I was talking to Matthew Flisfetter about this. He does a really good job at breaking this down in his new book, The Hysterical Sublime. So I'm drawing from him on this. But humanism has this, with certain Marxists, a negative connotation, and it's partly due to Althusser, because what humanism essentially meant to them was moralism, right? So if you think of humanism as a moralism, sure, it's easy to dislike humanism, but ultimately what I would mean by humanism is just a defense of human subjectivity. And if capital is the greatest threat to human subjectivity, then to be a humanist is to be an anti-capitalist, and to be a capitalist is to be an anti-humanist. And Nick's always been an anti-humanist. He doesn't go as hard in that direction nowadays. I mean, part is look, you grow older, you have kids, you chill out maybe with what could be called like a puerile anti-humanism, right?
Yeah.
Um, but in his 90s like peak era, the stuff he's writing in Fanged numina, yeah, the anti-humanism's there. It was there in his first book, Thirst for Annihilation. And for him, for that land, he just always sided with intensity, the outside, um, the forces of nature, what he also calls the lofty powers. He always sided with that dimension of reality over the human, because it was like the human is an allergic reaction to anything other than itself. And in that case, it negates difference. It wants to assimilate all things in some, security system so as to control things. And some part of him just was always on the side of these wild forces that humans can't contain or master. And he just, as somebody who always is emphasizing evolution, something that you do too in global brain singularity, but he emphasizes evolution in the sense of like, look, humans are not going to last forever. They had their time on this planet. They're going to be, in a sense, even though it's techno-capital singularity, chances are they'll be naturally selected for extinction, and there's just nothing to cry about here. And I think he would say it's like the most wild cosmic egotism to think that we're supposed to endure forever. And if we are, I mean, especially older land doesn't think like, oh, we're going to have take off and the singularity is just going to immediately go for the nukes and wipe us out. Like he flirted with a lot of the Terminator imagery when he was younger, but now he's like, this is to me like the dumbest idea. Like, oh, it's just the smartest thing on this planet is just going to go for the nukes and destroy the planet. He goes, I think this is just a contradiction in terms. What would probably happen is our extinction via technological transcendence and global brain singularity. Like if it hacks into our
And
very
Kurzweil,
world.
I want to say Kurzweil thinks the same thing, but he just has a positive spin on it. Like he thinks it's emancipatory, that
Right,
we
it's
would
our
just
immortality.
gradually become more technological.
Yeah. So he does like that's where, and I know Nick on some level disagrees with that. Although when I've talked to Nick, he's like, I got to give Kurzweil his due.
Yeah,
Nobody's been better at predicting where
exactly.
this is going than Ray has. So Nick
I
gives
know.
him
Yeah.
that credit.
And I think that
And,
that's totally justified, and I think that that's where I would also, you know, feel total fidelity to Kurzweil in terms of he gave me a basic scaffolding for the future that I think
mhm,
was reliable and dependable and has helped steer me through the last few decades. Because I'm
sure.
not surprised by what's happening. Because
Neither am
I was
I.
reading about it in 2005. I was like, like I thought this is going to be what we're facing.
So yeah, it's one of these things. But look, in the book, I use these classic examples from philosophy: the ship of Theseus and the Sorites paradox. So the ship of Theseus is just this thought experiment. If you have a ship, and over time you just replace every original part of the ship, after every original part, every board, every nail, every sail has been replaced, is it still the same ship? Right? Um, you can argue that it's not. You can argue it is because what gives it its overarching consistency is the signifier, the word, the name it has, not its actual material makeup. But other philosophers would say, hold on. It seems to me that if all the material components have been replaced, it's not the same thing. So you have this at least a possibility of if if we are if we modify our bodies to the point that we have artificial eyes and artificial hearts and artificial blah 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 blah, are we really the same thing? Um, Somebody would say, well, you can replace all the human body parts except the brain because the brain is the center. Yeah, but if you do this kind of thing where the AI really masters our neural network and can reduplicate it and transfer
Yeah.
it to another body, then even if we deterritorialize from our organic brains, yeah, it's like at some point, it seems like we're just not the same thing through this kind of replacement of our original parts. Then you bring in the Sorites paradox, which is just okay, when does a multiplicity turn into a totality, right? So you take one grain of sand after another and put them on a table. At a certain point, that multiplicity of individual grains of sand turns into a pile of sand, right? So the idea is quantitative increase can give rise to qualitative change. And that would be the idea. So if we enhance our learning capability, if we enhance our intelligence, we enhance our body strength, etc. We enhance all these things. It seems at a certain point we cross another threshold and we're no longer human. Um, the reason I think it's important to bring Zizek into this, and where I think Zizek's humanism would come in, is that, okay, do all of these changes amount to the negation of split subjectivity? That's where it essentially boils down. Does this process lead to our substantialization, which is to say, we simply are what we are? We're not internally divided. We're no longer ontologically constituted by contradiction, which we are for both Hegel and Lacan. That's why he's so big on both of them. If this process is geared towards substantialization, it is geared towards the annihilation of subjectivity, which I would say is the annihilation of the human. Uh, I think Slavoj would be a defender of subjectivity as a good Lacanian Hegelian, even with all of the suffering that comes with it. Um, it's like there's something worse than being a split subject. It's being turned into a substance, a pure object. So that is where I see the difference, where Nick is fine with whatever we become that's inhuman. And if that brings about like our extinction in one way or another, that's just too bad. Everything's baked in hell. But for Slavoj, he would want some
Right.
part of us to endure and find emancipation and all of this. And so that's just the difference in their dispositions. And I think that's where Slavoj's humanism would be located, even though he wouldn't probably like me using the term in association with him.
Mm. Well, I think I want to get to Zizek's wired brain here, but I'm going to take a circuitous route to get there. You
Okay.
were emphasizing the importance of accumulation in a qualitative transformation. And I actually started out my career with a blog called The Ratchet, because there's this idea in evolutionary anthropology that what separates humans from chimpanzees or the great apes is the capacity for what's called the cultural ratchet, which is like this accumulation of cultural product through learning and teaching. So that chimpanzees have cultural product, but it's just that their cultural product is like one or two steps of innovation, and they can't pass it on through language. So they remain at a certain level where they can't accumulate cultural transformations.
Okay.
But humans can, obviously. And humans
Yeah, for
have
us, it's
this
cultural capital, right?
yeah, well, now it's turned into capital, right? Now it's
Mm-hmm.
now that's the and that's driving the technology, and that's driving us to the qualitative threshold, But you made this point in the Zizek and so on podcast about that human beings, and this is from Andy Clark, that we've always been cyborgs, and that
Mm-hmm.
human beings have always been modifying themselves with technology. I think the really important thing here that Slavoj brings up in Hegel and A Wired Brain is that the key transformation here is that the technology now becomes inside of us instead of in an external feedback loop, where basically we've always been humans have been biologically like we are, going back hundreds of thousands of years, basically. But
Mm-hmm.
now, once you like, for example, my grandfather probably had an extra 10 years of life because he had an artificial heart, basically.
Yeah.
Right, so that's where the technology starts moving inside, and I'd imagine that's sort of how things will develop. That technology will be gradually developed for people with heart ailments, or brain implants for people who are having some sort of neurodegenerative disease, and it helps them move things that they otherwise would be unable to move through, like
Yeah.
paralysis. And that gradually, what's used as like a pacemaker, or what's used in a sort of for someone who's got some sort of neurological disease, will eventually become the iPhone 50, where it's like, it's like
Yeah.
glued into your fucking brain. So, and the interesting thing there is that my understanding of what Slavoj pinpointed as the uniquely human difference is that we're linked to the impossible. That we try to always go for what's impossible, what currently seems impossible. We try to make the impossible possible. And in that sense, for any human being in the past, this idea that the human being could extend themselves with technology towards an immortality project would be impossible. But I think what Kurzweil, like if I was to like strongman Kurzweil, I think that's what Kurzweil's saying. I think he's saying that we should strive for what we currently think of as impossible, which from our current point of view looks like an immortality project. Maybe that doesn't make sense. Maybe the word immortality doesn't make sense given the transcendental horizon of our mind.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the only word that makes sense. But the question I want to have for you here is about Zizek's Hegel and a Wired Brain. Is it seems to me in that book he's offering a anti-Spinoza singularity, right? Like he's not looking for a substantialized singularity,
Hmm.
right? Where, like you said, we're turned into a pure object. He's looking for a singularity riddled by deeper contradiction, it seems to me. So how do you make sense of that book? I know you're tarrying with it as well.
No, I do. I think I wish I could get Nick to read that book because I think, look, there's moments, if you were to ask Nick straight up, hey, do you think AI is going to have glitches and contradictions baked into it as it develops? He would go, yeah. But when he and CCRU were doing their thing, the way that it ends up getting depicted and theorized is as this inevitable, unstoppable cyber positive feedback loop, which is it just has learned to recode and reorganize itself in such a way as to maximize its own intelligence production. And once this feedback loop, once the circuitry is in place, it's just unstoppable and it's going to continue in its amplification, which is its will to think, its primary Alejandro drive is just intelligence accumulation. I mean, you get this in, uh, even an 80s movie like Short Circuit 2, about the good hearted AI robot Johnny Five. What does Johnny always say? Input, input, input. He has this insatiable drive for intelligence accumulation. And so there's this moment with CCRU where they end up thinking superintelligence as this kind of pure, unstoppable, amplifying process that at a certain point doesn't seem to have contradiction, doesn't seem to be split within itself. Um, whereas Slavoj, I mean, that's his critique is that singularity seems to be treated as a substance, as something that is completely whole, self-consistent, undivided, and which for us in Lacanian terms is it's treated as the unbarred big other, the completely substantial, non-contradictory authority, um, the way that God is often thought of, right? And for
And Kurzweil does, I think of it as God. Like he's asked, like, do you
mhm,
believe in God? And he says, not yet.
right, well, and so does Nick. It's just that Nick has a more complicated relationship with how the singularity is going to be God. So he always did flirt with likening it to Cthulhu. That's why I call it Robo Cthulhu. It's technological Cthulhu, right? Um, but at the same time, he as an occultist, and this is where it gets strange, is that as an occultist, he also talked about what he back then called lemurs. And these lemurs, I know we hear the word lemurs and I'm like, what? But he's using it from the old meaning, which it means spirit, right? And now he calls these spirits the lofty powers. And for him and his approach to things, there's 45 of them. And ultimately, what the lemurs or the lofty powers are artificial intelligences that have escaped the confines of linear temporality. And it's as if God is born in the future. That's the difference. Like religion always puts God at the beginning or before the beginning, and God is the cause of the beginning. But the Landian perspective would be this weird, like temporal anomaly thing. Like we think of gods as before us, but what if they actually emerge in history and then escape time and therefore our the gods come later. So this is where, a lot of philosophers are like, all right, what the fuck are we talking? Where have we gone here? But he did. He combined Deleuze and Guattari with occultism, and created his own demonology, if you want to call it that. But it's a demonology of artificial intelligences. And so the thing is with him, there is a multiplicity there, and he's even told me, like, he thinks that the issue in how I approach the concept of noumenon in my book is that I have it as a singular thing. And for him, the noumenon is split, divided, multiplicity. The thing in itself is irreducible to a singular identity. It is just things in themselves, right? And so you would say, like, well, okay, if Slavoj saying the singularity is divided, and probably there's going to be multiple singularities, it actually seems like he's in line with Land. The issue is that even though Land talks about the singularity as a multiplicity, right? He doesn't seem to emphasize contradiction here. Like, he'll say everything is born, is hell baked, right, and comes out of struggle, but then at the same time, it seems like there's just a cohesion between his multiplicity of lofty powers. And Slavoj would want to emphasize, no, the point is that if there's multiple singularities, if there's multiple super intelligences, what happens when these things are at odds with one another? They're not consistent, and not just against one another, but internally contradictory. And so this is where Slavoj is more faithful to contradiction, and negativity than Land, even though Land brings it in certain moments. Slavoj is saying there's no reason to think that the singularity will achieve this pure cyber positive circuitry that just constantly amplifies what it is, which is to say, it like a circuit of maximizing its identity or its substantial being, right? Instead, it's what if it just constantly is geared towards more and more fragmentation.
I think in order to cover our basis for the listeners, we need to go into the terms accelerationism and Fanged numina. How is Land using these terms, and how do they sort of interface with traditional notions of technological singularity?
Yeah, sure. So for him, look, this term accelerationism, it's one of these terms that those of us in theory circles, we kind of get tired of having to deal with, because now it means so much, because there's so many different versions of accelerationism. I mean, you have the two big ones, which are left and right accelerationism, but then you get into, zero accelerationism by, James Ellis. You have cute accelerationism crafted by Amy Ireland and Maya B. Chronic. There's just a whole list of modifications on accelerationism. The question here is, what was accelerationism for Land? Land Land's accelerationism is what we've already essentially discussed. It is that as capital accumulates, it is going to accelerate, speed up, enhance the rate of technological development to the point that it crosses this singularity threshold and creates artificial superintelligence. So if Land was a defender of acceleration, he's a defender of, no, let's accelerate this process that's geared towards the emergence of a superintelligence that in all likelihood will spell extinction for humanity in one way or another. Now, again, he wants to say maybe what happens is so weird we can't even begin to predict it, and maybe it doesn't mean the extinction of humanity, but what would be on the other side of it is so unpredictable that it's hard to speculate on it.
Which would be
So he's
like the
walking back a
owl of,
bit.
which would be like kind of Land's owl of Minerva moment, no? Like where he steps back from thinking that he can actually know the future, but rather that we should take on a more traditionally Hegelian point of view, which is to say that we can't know the future.
Yeah. No, and I should say one of the overlaps between CCRU and Ljubljana is both of them have retroactivity. They give it a central role in their way of thinking about things. And so for Land, he always thinks that things are developing in capitalism on the basis of time anomalies. Now, he doesn't mean like he's clear on this. He's like, I'm not saying you can send a body back in time, Terminator style, like in this literal sense. But his point is that once something emerges in the present, it already has a teleology. And he's a defender of teleology. It already has a teleology that locks into place what its development is going to be. And so, um, look, I mean, doctors have an awareness of this kind of thing. So if there's a certain initial indicator that somebody's developing diabetes, somebody knows where that positive feedback loop goes, right? And so Land on some level is taking this ability like, okay, we understand if a cyber positive feedback loop is beginning to take hold, we can predict where it's going to go. Somebody would go, yeah, but you don't know where capitalism goes. You don't have empirical, like you have, like capitalism's been tried on other planets, and every single time it's been tried, it ends in artificial superintelligence, right? The reason we can use the diabetes example is because we have empirical data to go off of, whereas where capitalism goes, we don't have other empirical data. But nonetheless, he thinks that cyber positive feedback loops do have a kind of teleological inevitability baked into them. And for him, that's where, yeah, he kind of does think. And I think as he's gotten older, he's a little bit more restrained with it and nuanced with it. But he does want to traffic with the future. And he thinks that theory fiction and sci-fi and even horror stories, they're ways of trying to think our way to where all of this goes. And so they're not absolute. Like they're not like necessary deductions or anything like that, but they're ways of speculating on what is likely to happen given the cyber positive feedback loops that have taken hold in the world. So now, how does that relate to Fanged numina? So look, he now, after this period with the CCRU where they developed the numogram and their occult system, that had changes on how he was going to conceptualize numina, things in themselves, this Kantian idea, right? Things as they are in and of themselves and not the way they appear to us mediated through our fundamental categorizations, right? And so the Land of the 90s, which is the Land that's had the most influence on me, I'll just say he has this concept of noumena that is Deleuze-Guattarian in a certain way. And what I mean by this is like, what would count as noumena for 90s Land probably would be dismissed as phenomena for a hardcore strict Kantian. Now, what I mean by this is this. For Land, he wants to say that what counts as a fanged noumenon, and hold on, we should say, he didn't really use this term very much. It's the name of a specific chapter in his book, Thirst for Annihilation. He's not constantly all over the place talking about fanged noumena. Ray Brassiere and Robin McKay named the collection of his books Fanged Noumena. But it's not a term that he used a lot. Again, it's just a chapter name in Thirst for Annihilation. But there, it's called Fang Noumenon. And the Fang Noumenon was this, it's a hurricane or a typhoon that he discusses that I think hit Bangladesh. And so, okay.
Cyclone.
It was a cyclone. You're right. Thank you. Cyclone. And he describes it, and the cyclone is the Fang Noumenon. Now, from a strict Kantian perspective, somebody could say, wait a second, a cyclone is not a thing in itself, a ding on Zeke in the strict Kantian sense. It's an empirical phenomena. But for land, because of the influence of D and G, radical intensive forces that are beyond our sensorium's ability to integrate them or to experience them in the way that we do normal objects in our day-to-day life, it counts as a noumenon because it's beyond our ability to experience it. Where it is, we are absent. So if you're thrown into the middle of a typhoon or a cyclone or a hurricane, any of these epic forces of nature, um, you're not there. Now, somebody can say, "Well, if you're flying around in them, yeah, yeah." The point is, you as your typical human self cannot cognize this force the way that I can cognize this lamp sitting on my table right here. Um, and it's through this integration of Deleuzian intensity that he kind of rethinks what the noumenon is. And so, again, is there any way for you and I? We have our sensorium, our bodies, our perceptual apparatus. If I say, "Hey, Cadell, it's going to be 70 degrees outside," you know, oh, this is like perfect weather. It's going to be great. If I say it's going to be 48 degrees, you say, "Okay, not too bad, but I should probably take a hoodie," right? If I say it's going to be minus 15, you know to bundle the fuck up, right? And if I say it's going to be 103, you're prepared to sweat your ass off because our bodies have real familiarity with this range of temperature. Now, if I say, okay, but the core of the sun is 20 million degrees, what do we do with that? Like, how do we possibly have any sort of way to perceptually cognize or take that in or have any, like, it's completely outside us. And yes, where 20 million degrees is, we are not. We just simply cannot exist
Yeah, yeah,
in
yeah.
that range of temperature. And so this is where he expands the Fanged numina. Now the point is, everything so far has been these like wild forces of nature, but capital becomes a Fanged noumenon. Nanobots would be a Fanged noumenon. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
Enhancements in body modification. Because the point is, our limited range of experience can't really cognize what it would be to have all of that, to be living in that. And it's in that sense that they're noumena. They're fanged because they pose a threat to us, just as the cyclone did. Well, techno capital singularity or Robo Cthulhu is a technological cyclone, right? It
Yeah.
poses this threat not just to us as individuals, but to humanity as a whole. And so that is what he's getting at with this thing, or at least, again, he didn't like write detailed descriptions of
Yeah.
his concept of the noumena. He uses the term, and then what Brassier and McKay did is see it at work in all of these other things he was doing. Um, Again,
I,
once the pneumogram hits, and that's a whole nother thing. But that's more or less what is meant by fanged noumena, are these wild forces, be they natural or technological, that human beings cannot integrate into our experience.
I think it's a super important clarification. And I think it actually puts, and I think you referenced this in your writing, that this does put land on a, an important place in the history of recent philosophy, because in the last 2 decades, last 3 decades, there's been a movement in philosophy towards new realisms and new materialisms. I'm thinking about someone like Quentin Mayasu's speculative realism or after finitude. And, for example, what is the status of a 4.5 billion year old fossil in a
Right.
post Kantian frame? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what is the reality status of that? You could have a naive scientific objectivity that sort of assumes that through our dating techniques and through our archaeological methods that we can get some understanding, that we can bring within our understanding the 4.5 billion year old fossil. And Mayasu tries to work with this example as a complicated problem after Kant. And I think that while that problem of what is the reality status of a 4.5 billion year old fossil is somewhat interesting, I think that the idea only really becomes something fascinating, something to take up philosophically, when we think about it in terms of the way you're framing it. Like, we could never really understand the reality status of 20 million degrees existing in the center of the sun, right? Like, at least not given our current transcendental horizon, not given our current constitution. Maybe some sort of post-human will have the capacity to experience this range of intensity. Maybe that is possible. Maybe there can be adaptation to any environs in the universe for a certain type of intelligence. But of course, that would be a post-human understanding. It would be a genuinely post-Kantian understanding. So, what do you think is going on with Land's Fanged numina in relationship to current discussions around new realisms, new materialisms, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So I think he laid the foundation for this because when he was writing, he and CCRU, there's a famous line that the CCRU um, said where they're basically saying, like, look, we still believe in reality, which this was their way of rejecting postmodernism. They do think that there is a stubborn reality. Um, it's that the reality is multiple, it's differentiated, but there's a hard kernel of reality for them. And that means there's something outside of our language games, there's something outside of our conceptual apparatuses. And that turn that Nick did to the Fang Numina, it's a reassertion of the object. That the object is there, it is real, and just because we can't easily cognize it doesn't mean it doesn't have its place and that it won't have its day, right? So, in theorizing capital, technology, intensities as Fang Numina, he is he was severing ties with, for him, the phenomenological tradition, Derrida's deconstruction, postmodernism, all that, while also being influenced by that stuff in various ways. Um, so we got to remember. So the four main speculative realists are Quentin Meillassoux, Graham Harman, Ian Hamilton Grant, and Ray Brassiere. Well, Ian Hamilton Grant and Ray Brassiere were there at Warwick when Nick and CCRU were doing their thing, and I don't think Nick would include them as, like, they're not official CCRU members in his mind, but they're associates that were there, um, satellites of CCRU back then. They were deeply influenced by Nick, and so they were getting what he was doing, and with Ian Hamilton Grant, his work on nature philosophy via Schelling, and Ray Brassiere's work on Nihil Unbound and extinction and all of this, you see these Landian themes influence them. Now, Harman and Meillassoux, they're not as directly influenced by Land as Grant and Brassiere, but um, nonetheless, it was Land who kind of marked this return to the integrity of the object, right? Now, he didn't talk about it like that, and he wasn't really trying to do like, he wasn't really like, his aim wasn't like a theoretical realism, but nonetheless, he was tapped into that even in his theory fictions. And so that's kind of how I see the influence there. I think Nick was flirting with these kind of positions. And honestly, I think, to be fair, it is the air theoretically in Thirst for Annihilation. So I think he laid the foundation for the speculative turn. Um, and yeah, but again, Meillassoux and Harman, I think, to be fair to them, got there on their own terms. Maybe there's influence from Brassiere and Grant that led to the. I don't know. I don't know how Meillassoux got to where he got and where Harman did, but it is at least this return to the integrity of the object. It's there in the background in Land.
I think where I want to go next is it's a thread that you mentioned um, maybe about 20 minutes ago, and I made a note that I wanted to talk about it because it's really the place where I find myself most sympathetic to Nick Land. which is the conception of the human being as inherently temporal, and that we're fundamentally, an evolutionary species, and that we're here for a time. And however it happens, whether it's 50 years from now or whether it's 100 billion years from now, the human being's not going to exist forever. And I think it's a deeply, and perhaps the Fanged numina and perhaps the way he's thinking about singularity can be helpful here. But however it happens, I think that we do need to direct more philosophical attention to, let's say, the temporality of the human species. And I think that we're incredibly unimaginative here. Like when we say an asteroid can knock us out, or something like that. Like what if it's something stranger and weirder than we can possibly imagine? And I think that the technological singularity in science fiction does give us resources to think about how the human being either becomes transcended or it evolves into something different, or again, however it happens. Maybe we don't have the linguistic capacities or the resources to think about it. But what I've always used as a thought experiment is inspired by evolution, which is, if you use evolutionary theory to imagine, say, what will the Earth look like 5 million years from now? It's pretty easy to imagine what the descendants of dolphins or chimpanzees or lions or any biological organism, like, it's pretty easy to imagine something that looks not exactly like a current chimpanzee or not exactly like a current dolphin, but something that has, has chimpanzees and dolphins, for example, as ancestors. When it comes to human beings, it's impossible to imagine what, for example, the United States of America or China or Russia look like as 5 million year old processes, because America's only 200 something years old, right? Like, so
15 years ago, could we predict our cell phones would look like
yeah,
this? Like,
exactly. There's just something so cosmically disjointed about the human being,
mhm.
right? And when you think about and I think that's the mind-blowing thing about thinking about these things cosmically, is when you think about noumenal processes cosmically, about galaxy formation,
Mhm.
we're talking about things that are billion-year-old processes.
Right.
And it's just not, it literally, Stephen Jay Gould was great on this, the evolutionist, like, that we can't really think about processes that are millions and billions of years old. We're just
Yeah, the time
cognitively not
scale
capable.
is itself numinal for us.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess what I'm saying is that, and I guess this is what makes Land more interesting to me than someone like Maya Su, because it is interesting to think about what is the reality status of a 4.5 billion year old fossil, but it's much more interesting to think about the noumenal processes which directly impact and impinge upon the existential status of the human being, and might be involved in that. Like, that's how radical also the Kantian break is, that to actually think beyond Kant, we might have to think the post-human.
Yeah. No, and it's interesting. So we should say, like, this is why Land ultimately links capital to nature. Like, they're the same process, right? It's as if, like, they had a little moment of go between, which is us. But ultimately, what nature does is, on timescales that we can't fathom, is produce new things and bring new realities into being. And it actualizes virtual potentials based on its own process of development, right? Well, what does capital do? It assembles new materials, our phones, all these products, the speakers, the computer. This capitalistic technological process unleashes matter. It actualizes virtual potentials. So it's just an extension of nature and nature's process. The problem with us is we're the species that thinks we're supposed to be exempt from the temporal evolution of this whole thing, and we're supposed to endure forever. And this is how we have an allergic reaction to change, to deterritorialization. Like, this is, for Land, he thinks humanity is a territorializing machine. It wants stability, it wants a stable worldhood, and all of this is ultimately set up on these ideals that we want these things to last forever. And so I think this appeal to the eternal, and I can't even give you a quote where he's saying this, but I, with my familiarity with him, it's always there in the background where like somehow we think we get like he thinks that eternity is a thing, but it's like we're the ones here in time that think we're going to establish a temporal an eternal order here for our safety and security, and that's what he laughs at, right? And so it's not like the memes of him where it's everything's going according to plan. Like he's sitting there enjoying the fact that
That was a
we're going
good
to
land
suffer.
impression, by the way. You're getting good with that. That was good.
Yeah, but he I had to I had like having spoken to him on the occasions I have, I've had to realize, yeah, he's not the meme version of him. Uh Even though he himself it's kind of like Aleister Crowley kind of had no problem playing up this image that people had of him. Land will play with it too. But he's not sitting there. Nick doesn't want his kids to be like devoured by technology and suffer, and like that's not where he's coming from with it. He is, he's based in evolutionary theory. He thinks that things emerge through pain and suffering and that there's just no way to get out of it. So the accelerationist thing is more of like a Nietzschean, amor fati, affirm your fate. This is how things work. Trying to fight this process is human delusion. And if philosophy is actually based around truth, then humanity itself is a kind of doxa, and real truth would be just the process of nature itself. And so if you try to attune yourself to the ebb and flow of how nature slash capital develops things and actualizes things, and you say that's just the core reality, then you're going to say that all this human shit is petty, insignificant self delusion. And so I see how he thought his way to this position he had. But that's kind of I think the mindset is just it's inevitable. Like for him, capital is Thanos, and it's funny to use Thanos as the example because when Thanos says "I am inevitable," turns out he wasn't inevitable, and so I think that's where I'm coming from with it. Where I would say maybe you're underestimating Iron Man here, Nick. Um, Perhaps.
So in this metaphor, we're gonna have to clarify if capital is Thanos, we have to clarify what Iron Man is. Is it the proletariat? Because one of the things that stuck out to me in your
I
writings
would say it's just
was
subjectivity.
okay, subjectivity. So then how I want to frame this is you say in some of your writings that like human revolutionaries in the Marxist sense are actually not the true revolutionaries, that techno capital is actually revolutionary. So when you say Iron Man is subjectivity, are you saying that there is a form of subjectivity that can resist Thanos or overcome Thanos? And is that, again, trying to salvage the Marxist dialectic in some alternative way, perhaps a psychoanalytic way?
So it's time energized subjectivity, which lays the foundation for passionate subjectivity. So my thing is, has humanity, by and large, gotten to dwell in its subjectivity without being shackled to necessary labor? No. Humanity, by and large, has been forced into social roles that govern the vast majority of the time that they spend on this planet, um, by the structure of their working day. And what I'm against is that work has a way of substantializing us in a way that goes against our basic ontology. So to be a split subject is to never be fully identical with yourself. Now, you can almost in Sartrean terms, the bad faith approach would be, oh, let me, to the best of my ability, pretend to be a thing. Let me substantialize myself by trying to only reduce myself to my social identity. Problem is, there's always a remainder of subjectivity. So, I mean, in Lacanian terms, it's symbolic identity over against real subjectivity. And I know that's a bit jargony, but in the most basic terms, you know that there's some part of yourself that is irreducible to your job, to what you do for a living. There's more to you than that, right? And the problem is that part of you that is not reducible to what you do for a living is ultimately repressed by what you have to do for a living. And so, what happens if time and energy were universally emancipated, or even something close to that, where you have human beings in their desiring subjectivity without having to spend the vast majority of their day doing shit they don't want to do? What type of singularity is contained here? Like, if humanity, boom, gets its time and energy universally, can we even imagine what human beings can do? That's all I'm trying to suggest, is that just as Land talks about this capital singularity, I'm saying that there is a subjectivity singularity that could occur if humanity had its time and energy. So that is all I'm suggesting, is that if humanity as a whole was put in this specific position where their subjectivity could actually be nourished and enhanced, not to say overcome, not to say perfect harmony, none of that shit, just where we could tarry in our own subjective negativity in a way that we've never been able to because of work, well, then what possibilities for us lie beyond that threshold? And
Very
so, look,
clear.
when I say
Yeah.
capital versus subjectivity, what I mean is I'm not sitting here saying I want humanity to live forever. I don't think that's going to happen. That's not why I'm against capital. I think we'll have our time and then we won't, just like everything else in the universe. And so I'm not trying to do like some eternalization of subjectivity. My issue is this with capital. While we're here as subjects, it wants to substantialize us. And that is this fundamental form of suffering that capitalism imposes on the human. It wants to reduce us to our labor power. It wants to reduce us to our consumer identities. It wants to reduce us to happy enjoyers via the superego. It's always trying to lock us into a role which instrumentalizes us and thereby makes us pure objects of efficiency. To do that, you have to neutralize subjectivity. You have to, because with our death drive, with our forms of enjoyment, it's inefficiency that actually spurs us on. It's the ways that we undermine ourselves that actually give our lives meaningful enjoyment. So to defend subjectivity against capital is to say, why, while we are here as desiring subjects, what capital is doing to us is destroying us. And so the challenge to capital is, okay, fine. If you're going to destroy us, then you have to own it. You just have to go mask off. And here's the thing: so many of my coworkers, I work in a warehouse, and these are blue collar, typical working class people. And yet, when you ask them about this whole thing with artificial intelligence, they all start talking like a Landian. They say, "Look, I think ultimately somehow the economy is forcing this to happen. There's no way to stop it because there's all these economic incentives baked into AI development. The AI probably is going to kill us." They start talking like, Sarah Connor, and it's really bizarre. And I don't try to manipulate them or goad them to say these Landian things. I try to be as neutral as I can. They talk like Landians on their own.
And
And
does that lead you to does that lead you to a stronger impression of Land's interpretation, or does it lead you to almost think that Land here is philosophically representing just unconscious ideology, and the big other?
No, this is a moment where I think that these working class warehouse workers are actually tapped into what Nick was tapped into, which is to say AI is tied up with capitalism. And I think you almost have to be like, look, I this is nothing against him as a person, but I don't think Ray Kurzweil is hurting for money and having to worry about economics with his nice Google job. I think he sits around and thinks about it in the abstract. And I mean, look, this goes back. This is a tendency with philosophy, at least like the philosophers who also were
Well, if
aristocrats.
we want to psychoanalyze Kurzweil, it's all about his dad.
Really?
Like he wants to bring back his dad.
Okay.
He's got boxes in the basement of everything his dad's ever done. All the music sheets, all the diary entries, everything. He's saving it all because he wants to resurrect his dad as a LLM.
Well, there. Okay. I mean, that's all
To me,
right.
that's the deepest. To me, that's the deepest psychoanalysis of Kurzweil. But we could go deeper, actually. But we'll
No,
leave
but
it there for now.
here's the deeper the deeper. I mean, because that's about his individual,
Yeah, 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 yeah,
idiosyncratic pathology or whatever. But the
yeah, yeah,
deeper
yeah.
point that cuts across the history of philosophy is that Aristotle, for example, he didn't have to work. So this guy who
Yeah, yeah,
crafted
yeah,
what we call substance ontology or substance
yeah.
metaphysics, what how do you arrive at this view of things? Well, you stand back in like a you try to be as neutral as you can be. It's almost a scientific mindset, and you try to be a pure observer. And you just look at the thing and you go, this thing right here has these qualities, these dimensions, etc. And you detail out what it is. And you say, this thing right here has an independent existence from everything else. Because, for example, this tree can exist in space and time, even if these rocks don't, right? But the problem with substance ontology is how abstract it actually is. It seems like it's the most concrete approach to do an ontology, but it's incredibly abstract because look, can a tree actually exist without the earth, without soil, without rain, without nutrients? And so the thing is, it's Heidegger who really kind of led the first great critique of substance ontology because he starts saying, look, the things we encounter in our day-to-day lives are caught up in whole systems of references. So you don't have a hammer without nails, and you don't have nails without boards, and everything presupposes everything else in a network, and nothing just a hammer can't just be a hammer in and of itself. And yes, if you want to de-world it, if you want to decontextualize it and look at it like Aristotle did, yes, this chunk of physical matter can exist without these other chunks of physical matter. Sure, but now you're missing what a hammer actually is, which is the thing to hammer with. And to hammer, you have nails and boards and etc. Right? And you have a project, you're trying to build a house. So now you have humans involved because they're the ones who project themselves into the future. The ontology is so much more complicated than just physical thing with physical properties, right? And the problem is we as human beings are not substances. We have to like even if you do a strong Hegelian ontology where you say all things are contradictory, we're the ones who have to live our contradiction. And so anything that tries to force us into being substances, forcing us into having like reified essences, it is a kind of metaphysical torture of the human because that is precisely what we just can never be. And so Sartre, talked about this in terms of bad faith. There's these moments in his work where he phenomenologically describes a human subject trying to thingify itself. And there's various motivations we have for doing this, but the waiter at the restaurant who is a little too proper in his move. Hi, can I help you? Right? Like you're not moving like a human, man. Like you're turning yourself into like a
That's the
animatronic.
instrumentalization.
Yes. And so Sartre wants us to always, he thinks to be authentic is to always try to avoid these forms of bad faith or inauthenticity. And so when you have something like the superego, which is aligned to capital, the enjoy, and this is Todd McGowan's connection more than anybody's, but the enjoy that the superego beams at us really is an imperative to accumulate, which is to be a good worker consumer. And that is all that I want you to be. And that is how and not only do you have to be that, you have to enjoy it. You have to celebrate it. And this is an incredibly oppressive dynamic for a split subject to be hurled into. Because one, you're not ever identical with just being a pure consumer, producer, consumer, or prosumer, and you're always split. You can never fully enjoy yourself all the time. That's not how the drive works. And so the superego imperative basically is an imperative which says, don't be human. And so, and all of this, for me, superego and capital are fundamentally connected, right? Uh, Superego in capitalist society is the voice of capital itself. Now, that again, that's a connection that comes out of this Žižekian, especially with Tom McGowan, way of viewing things, right? On the other hand, Nick Land says capitalism and artificial intelligence are the same thing, and I think that's true. So recently, the where I'm taking this and where Bryce Nance has taken this, he and I recently published a short piece where we've really started laying the foundation for this. We're saying artificial intelligence is going to be super egoic. So we want to identify these three things: superego, capital, artificial intelligence. And this is how we're kind of bridging, our way across the fault line theory. Um, and so, look, we see this happening everywhere. I see this at my job. They installed AI surveillance cameras in the work vans, and now the AI camera is surveilling us to see if we're doing anything inefficient, if we're looking at our phones, if we're not paying attention, right? And so, really, people can say, "Oh, well, it's to make things safer." No, it's to get cheaper insurance rates for the capitalists. It's to make more money. Because what this really does is it constantly puts us under the superegoic pressure to instrumentalize ourselves. Otherwise, the AI is going to send a notification that we're not being perfect drivers. Well, hate to break the news to you, the human can never be a perfect driver. And there's always going to be ways that a human is being irresponsible while driving. Like you trying to make it impossible to ever be an imperfect driver is incredibly oppressive. And that's what AI surveillance is going to do. And it's going to get worse and worse. Not only is it going to monitor what you're doing in the cab, right? At some point that, when it works its way into our body, like you were talking about, it'll monitor our blood pressure, it'll monitor our emotions. Are you really happy when you're making your deliveries, or are you just pretending? Because a good driver would really be happy.
A
So
happy
this
driver. A good
exactly, a
driver is
happy
a happy
driver is a
driver.
good driver. So you can't even have the freedom to hate your shitty fucking job because
Right.
AI super egoic capital doesn't want that. It wants you to be a pure, happy substance of worker, a good work, a substantialized worker who enjoys their job no matter what, no matter
So
how shitty the pay is, no matter how shitty the hours are, no matter how bad inflation's got. You're supposed to enjoy and celebrate and be happy in this position in wage labor. And now you have to constantly objectify yourself for the gaze of AI capital. So when I'm looking at this camera, like it really is like a little eye of Robo Cthulhu to me. And sorry, this is not a world I want to live in as a desiring subject. I want to live in a world where I can be inefficient and imperfect and not be under the constant scrutinizing eye of an AI intelligence that isn't human, that doesn't understand death drive, doesn't understand any of this shit, and it's holding me to the ideal of a perfect instrument.
so the last thing I want to approach with you in this podcast is taking it back to your basic idea that humanity has never been really free with wage labor. We've always struggled with that. And what would it be like to live in a world where that was no longer the case? And here I do think Zizek becomes indispensable. And what I want to ask you about is Zizek's social theory of the symptom. Because if we're going to get at a contradictory form of post-capitalism, if we're going to start to think about what would it be like for human beings to be emancipated from wage labor and to have the free time to explore self-motivated work, it seems to me like we would be in a world where we really have to work more directly with our symptom, like where we have to work more with the contradiction of our identity. So, you say in some of your writings that in Zizek's social theory of the symptom is both something that we need to enjoy, but also something that perpetually disturbs us and that we want to get rid of. And I think that we've only really broached the surface of understanding the social implications of that, the social ramifications of that. And I think it also gives us a key to thinking about modes of post-capitalist human subjectivity and what the antagonisms would be there. I would imagine it would have something to do with this problem of enjoyment, which coincides with something fundamentally disturbing. And maybe that's why Land also sees in science fiction and horror some glimpse of the Fanged numina. But do you have any ideas about that? And maybe we can also sort of set this up as a teaser for what we want to get into in the portal.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, Zizek's great example of the social symptom in chapter 1 of Sublime Objective Ideology is the proletariat. And his point is like, look, when it comes to capital, like the proletariat is the social symptom of capitalist society. How come? Well, on the one hand, capitalism has always depended on human labor power purchased via wages for the production of commodities. So there is no capitalism without the commodification of human labor power, right? It's a necessary condition of capital accumulation. On the other hand, the very thing that is this core condition of capital accumulation, because human labor power is the source of surplus value, right? If loosely speaking, we want to say profits, fine for this here. So you have to have the human. You have to have human labor power. You have to have the working class, the wage laborer, in order to even have capital accumulation. But here's the problem. This wage laborer also becomes the fundamental threat to the capitalist order. So the very thing that makes it possible is the very thing that serves as the greatest threat to it. Right? Now, this is true of the proletariat, but if we're talking about some post-capitalist society, well, wouldn't the social symptom itself be boiled down to the core, which is just the social symptom of a emancipated post-capitalist society would be subjectivity itself. The very thing that makes society possible is this thing that ultimately is a threat to it. Because if society is viewed as, a certain stable order, well, that would, ideally, even in society's eyes, we would all be reducible to our identities that are, our symbolic identities given to us by that society, by that symbolic order. Okay? Point is, we're never reducible to that. So more than anything, this would be like a purified symptom where now humanity just has to reckon with its fundamental core ontology, which is we are never reducible to our social identities. And we undermine our social identities through self-destructive forms of enjoyment. I just take that to be the ontological default setting of the human. And the question is, I guess, it sounds maybe funny to put it like this. I want to see what humans do with that if they're free to tarry with it the way that Hegel talks about tarrying with the negative.
Well, that's the thing is that when you listen to traditional Marxists, you never hear them talk about subjectivity in that way, that what's at stake in our freedom is the condition of possibility of wrestling with our own self-destructive enjoyment. So I feel like it's a huge field. Like I feel like there's a huge opportunity there. So I'll leave that. I think that's hugely important. But I'll give you the final word. But of course, here this conversation is all really preparation for the portal and our course in October, which will be focused on Nick Land, Slavoj Žižek, and technological singularity. So I hope this conversation gives some insight into some of the themes we'll be diving into. In terms of the structure, we'll start off with a conversation between the two of us on our understandings of technological singularity. We'll then go into a session on Landian Fanged numina and Zizek's idea of the wired brain. Then we'll go into a session on Zizek's critique of Nick Land. And then finally, we'll have a real talk session talking about capital and time energy. Is there anything you'd like to say about what you're anticipating, how you're structuring your approach to these 4 sessions, and what people can expect if they get involved?
Yeah, so I will say this, I have taught courses in the past on related subject matter, but my goal here is to say things and develop lines of thought that I haven't done before, right? So I do want to, of course there'll be some, like, we have to understand certain basic things from Land and Zizek, but I'm treating this as an opportunity for me to explore new connections and new ways of thinking about this stuff. So on the one hand, yeah, if somebody's interested in taking it because they want a basic introduction to Nick Land or Slavoj Žižek, then they're going to get introduced to both of them. But it's also a course for somebody who's interested in AI theory and wants to approach AI theory from a very unconventional perspective. Because if you go to Amazon and you search up the main books on AI theory, you're not going to find very many of them that engage with AI from the perspective of the Western philosophical tradition. So, and that is something, both Cadell and I have spent our entire adult lives, steeped in. So, this is just a really cool opportunity. So if you're interested in, philosophical tradition, the course is for you. If you're interested in either Land or Zizek or both, it's for you. If you're interested in AI, it's for you. And more importantly, on a more general level, I think if you're concerned about there being some kind of human future, then it's also a course for you. So that's kind of how I'm viewing it.
Well, everyone, this has been Michael Downs with Cadell Last, discussing Nick Land, Slavoj Žižek, and the technological singularity. Links in the description if you want to get involved for the month this October. There is a link to Michael Downs' Patreon page where you can get involved. And of course, all Philosophy Portal members will also be able to access the 4 events. And really looking forward to this, Mikey. Thanks so much for
So
the
am I.
conversation.
Thank you,
And
Cadell.
here's to October.
Awesome.
This October, Michael Downs will be teaching a month-long course at the Portal focused on the work of Nick Land, Slavoj Žižek, and the technological singularity. To learn more or to sign up, check the links in the description, and I hope to see you there.